It was supposed to be a night of glamour, of lights, cameras, and celebration. But instead, it became a battlefield, a stage for a conflict that had been quietly simmering for years. Imagine walking into a room filled with the world's most prestigious actors, filmmakers, and influencers, only to be told that your own brother had decided you were not welcome. No explanation, no compromise, just a silent decree that you were to stay away. That is exactly what happened, allegedly. When whispers began circulating that Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, had been barred from attending the 2026 BAFTA Awards. And the brother behind this? None other than Prince William. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. At first glance, it sounds almost surreal. Two brothers, raised in the same gilded halls, sharing the same childhood memories, now standing on opposite sides of an invisible but unyielding wall. How does it come to this? How does familial loyalty crumble in public view, leaving a trail of confusion, hurt, and explosive curiosity? Tonight, we dive into that very question. We explore what it means when royalty, image, and personal pride collide, and how a single event can ripple across not just palace corridors, but the entire world stage. But let's pause for a moment. Why would William, known to be steadfast, methodical, even protective, make such a move? And why would Harry, so often portrayed as impulsive, passionate, and public-facing, react with the intensity that sources suggest he did? These are not mere hypotheticals. They are the beating heart of a story that combines scandal, secrecy, and sibling rivalry on a scale few can imagine. This isn't about who wore what at a gala. This is about power, perception, and the invisible rules that govern the world's most scrutinized family. And make no mistake, every action, every decision, even the smallest gesture, is amplified 1,000 times over when the world is watching. So let's set the scene. The BAFTAs, an event synonymous with cinematic prestige, were to be held in early 2026. Every seat in the hall mattered, every arrival was noted, and every absent face sparked conversation. When word began to circulate that Harry might not be attending, insiders were immediately struck by the shock of it. Some suggested it was protocol. Others hinted at palace politics, and a few murmured darker possibilities. Was this a deliberate slight, a preemptive strike in an ongoing royal chess game? And the question on everyone's lips: what did Harry think when he heard the news? Did he feel anger, hurt, betrayal, or a combination of all three? Before we can answer that, we need to understand the context, the simmering tension that had been building quietly for years. From the very beginning, Harry and William's paths were intertwined and complicated. Brothers, yes, but also public figures molded by duty, expectation, and the constant glare of the media. Childhood memories, private jokes, shared tragedies. None of that exists in isolation. Every relationship carries layers, and there's carried more scrutiny than most families could ever endure. When cracks appeared, they were never just cracks. They were headlines, viral clips, talking points dissected by commentators and casual observers alike. And yet, despite the scrutiny, some moments of tension remained private until now. What makes this particular story resonate is the timing. In early 2026, the world was already watching the Sussexes and the Cambridge family with renewed interest. Harry's forays into public life, his appearances, philanthropic initiatives, and media ventures had made him a polarizing figure. Some admired him for breaking the mold, for stepping beyond traditional royal confines. Others saw him as reckless or even disloyal. William, conversely, represented stability, continuity, and a certain predictability that reassured a global audience hungry for order. And in this fictionalized yet emotionally plausible scenario, the BAFTA decision was more than a social maneuver. It was a symbolic clash of two worldviews, two approaches to life, and two interpretations of what it means to belong to a family under constant observation. But the intrigue doesn't stop there. Sources hint at conversations behind closed doors that no public announcement ever revealed. Whispered arguments in Kensington Palace, late-night phone calls, advisors pacing the halls, debating the risks of a public confrontation. Each discussion, each decision, was laden with potential consequences. Every palace aide understood the stakes. One misstep, and the story could spiral out of control, dominating headlines worldwide. Which, of course, it did. And it all started with a single decision: the ban. Now, think about the human element. Harry, often described as fiercely loyal yet emotionally charged, was reportedly blindsided. Imagine being ready to walk into a room, to celebrate the art and culture you admire, only to be told, perhaps in a whisper or a coldly drafted note, that you were no longer welcome. How do you process that? Shock, disbelief, anger, and heartbreak collide in a way that is intensely personal, yet magnified on a global scale. How does one react when the very family meant to provide support suddenly becomes the source of exclusion? And more importantly, what does one do next when the eyes of the world are already watching your reaction? Of course, William's perspective cannot be ignored. The eldest brother, raised with the weight of expectation, often tasked with preserving image and tradition, faced his own pressures. Public perception, the desire to maintain control, the need to project unity while managing underlying tensions, all of this influenced the decision. From his perspective, this wasn't just about Harry. It was about signaling to the world that certain boundaries, protocols, and roles were non-negotiable. And yet, that action, calculated or otherwise, had consequences that rippled far beyond the palace walls. And here is where the narrative deepens. Reports, or at least insider rumors, suggest that the ban itself may have been the tip of a much larger iceberg. Secret meetings convened at Kensington, conversations with BAFTA organizers, discussions about potential media fallout, even whispers of intermediaries being sent to gauge Harry's response before any announcement. Every element points to one undeniable truth. What seemed like a simple decision was, in reality, a carefully orchestrated drama unfolding in real time. But the question remains, why escalate matters to this point? Why risk a public rift that could define both brothers for years to come? This is not a story with easy answers. It is messy, emotional, and rife with contradictions. And that is exactly why it captivates. Audiences are drawn to the tension between loyalty and self-interest, between love and duty, between public expectation and private desire. It's a narrative that resonates not because it is perfect, but because it is flawed, human, and relatable, even when set against the gilded backdrop of royalty. And as we prepare to dive deeper into the chapters ahead, consider this: the ban was not just a single event. It was a catalyst, a spark igniting a series of reactions that would expose vulnerabilities, test allegiances, and reveal sides of both brothers the public rarely, if ever, sees. From secret palace corridors to global media headlines, from whispered conversations to emotional confrontations, this story stretches across multiple layers of intrigue, and each one builds upon the last. By the end of this exploration, you will not only understand the fictionalized chain of events leading up to the BAFTA controversy, but also the emotional currents running beneath the surface. The stakes are high, the emotions raw, and the consequences far-reaching. And as the night of the BAFTAs approaches, the world holds its breath. What will happen when Harry faces the possibility of exclusion? How will William reconcile authority with brotherhood? And more importantly, what secrets lie hidden, waiting to be revealed? But before we get there, we need to go back to the very beginning. We need to understand the simmering tensions, the moments of misunderstanding, and the emotional threads that connect and, at times, divide these brothers. Only then can we fully grasp the magnitude of the BAFTA ban and the drama that unfolded in its wake. And so, the story begins not with a gala, but with a rift. A rift that would come to define a pivotal moment in this imagined royal saga. Because make no mistake, this is more than just a story about a family disagreement. It is a story about power, image, expectation, and the fragile bonds of brotherhood. And as you follow along, ask yourself, what would you do if someone you loved and trusted made a decision that shook the very foundation of your world? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but for those paying attention, the signs were unmistakable. A lingering tension in the air, a stiff greeting at public events, and subtle hints in off-the-record conversations, all pointed to one undeniable truth. The bond between Prince Harry and Prince William was fraying. It wasn't sudden. It hadn't appeared overnight. This was a slow burn, years in the making, a rift that had been quietly widening behind palace walls while the world remained oblivious. But now, the tension had reached a tipping point, and the BAFTA controversy was merely the catalyst, the first spark to set off a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. Let's rewind for a moment to understand what led here. Harry and William's childhood was filled with moments that should have fostered closeness. Late-night games in the palace, shared family vacations, private jokes whispered in corridors only they could understand. But it was also marked by extraordinary pressures. Public scrutiny, relentless media attention, and the heavy weight of expectation. Every move, every word, every glance was dissected, analyzed, and broadcast to millions around the world. That kind of constant pressure changes people. It forces them to compartmentalize emotions, to wear masks, to hide cracks in their armor. And cracks inevitably appear. As they grew older, differences between the brothers became more pronounced. William, as the heir, carried the invisible burden of duty like a second skin. Every decision he made, every public appearance, was filtered through the lens of responsibility. He was methodical, disciplined, and cautious, someone who thought 5 steps ahead and considered every possible consequence before acting. Harry, on the other hand, developed a streak of independence, a willingness to challenge norms, to push boundaries, and to prioritize personal conviction over tradition. That independence, while admired by some, created friction in a family built on hierarchy and adherence to protocol. By the time the 2026 BAFTAs rolled around, this friction had evolved into something deeper, something more insidious. Insiders describe it as a simmering resentment, a combination of old grievances, misunderstandings, and the pressures of living in an environment where loyalty and image often conflict. There were moments that could have been turning points. An unreturned phone call, a public statement taken out of context, a private disagreement over a charitable initiative, but each was carefully managed, hidden from public view, until now. The cracks were no longer manageable. They were becoming impossible to ignore. Imagine what it would feel like to be caught in that dynamic. On one side, there is William, representing order, tradition, and the expectations of millions. On the other side, Harry, embodying a desire for autonomy, for breaking free from constraints that feel suffocating. Every encounter carries an undercurrent of tension. Every conversation is a negotiation, whether acknowledged or not. And every public appearance becomes a test, a reminder that they are not just brothers, but symbols of competing values and ideals. The BAFTA event, in this context, was more than just a ceremony. It was a stage where these competing forces would inevitably collide. The world would watch not just the celebrities on the red carpet, but the subtle interactions of two brothers whose relationship had been deteriorating in silence. And the consequences of their actions, or inaction, were magnified exponentially by the media, the public, and the ever-present eyes of palace staff who monitored every detail. Sources suggest that the first signs of the BAFTA tension emerged weeks before the ceremony. Meetings were held, advisors whispered warnings, and security personnel were briefed on possible scenarios. Harry, according to insiders, sensed something was off even before the official communication arrived. Subtle changes in tone, unexpected cancellations, and the careful positioning of public appearances signaled that a decision was being made behind closed doors. But no one, not even Harry, could have anticipated the magnitude of what was coming. And then came the moment that would become the epicenter of this drama, the ban. Allegedly, William decided, after much deliberation, that Harry should not attend the BAFTAs. The reasoning, according to the whispers, was complex. On one level, it was about protocol, maintaining a sense of decorum, preserving the public image of the royal family, and ensuring that appearances aligned with expectations. On another, deeper level, it was about control, a symbolic assertion of authority in a relationship that had grown increasingly strained. The effect, however, was immediate and profound. For Harry, it was a personal blow. For the palace, it was a public relations tightrope. And for the world, it became a tantalizing mystery, ripe for speculation and sensational headlines. What makes this rift so compelling is the human element. Beyond titles, crowns, and ceremonial duties, these are two men navigating the complexities of family, loyalty, and personal ambition under extreme scrutiny. How do you reconcile love and loyalty with disappointment and frustration? How do you maintain dignity while feeling undermined? These are questions that resonate far beyond the gilded walls of Kensington Palace. And for Harry and William, the answers were elusive, complicated by the very nature of their lives. The tension manifested in subtle ways. Public appearances that once showcased camaraderie now hinted at distance. An awkward glance, a stiff handshake, a moment of silence where laughter once lived. Advisors reportedly worked tirelessly to maintain appearances, drafting schedules, scripting interactions, and advising on body language. Yet, the world, hungry for scandal, began to notice. Observers commented on every nuance, every deviation from the expected. And the brothers themselves were caught in a paradox. The harder they tried to manage perception, the more the rift seemed to deepen. Emotionally, the stakes were staggering. Harry reportedly felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and confusion. He had devoted himself to causes that reflected his values, worked tirelessly to carve a path that was both authentic and impactful, and yet he was being sidelined by the very person who had once been his closest ally. For William, the challenge was different but equally weighty. He had to balance personal feelings with duty, family loyalty with public expectation, and the desire for control with the risk of public fallout. Every decision carried consequences, and every action was scrutinized under a microscope that allowed no room for error. And yet, despite the intensity of the situation, there were moments of reflection, brief flashes where both brothers likely questioned their own choices. Did this ban achieve the intended effect? Could it have been handled differently? Was it worth the emotional toll it exacted on both sides? These questions lingered, unspoken, as the world watched and speculated. The human drama was palpable, even if much of it remained behind closed doors. By now, the stage was set. The BAFTA ceremony loomed like a looming mountain, and the world awaited the inevitable collision. Every advisor, every family member, and every friend of the brothers understood that this was no ordinary event. It was a crucible, a test of relationships, reputation, and resilience. And as the night approached, tension built to a crescendo, with each passing day adding layers of anticipation, speculation, and emotional weight. But what makes this story irresistible is not just the tension itself, it's the unpredictability. Despite careful planning, despite every precaution, the outcome was far from certain. How would Harry respond? Would he accept the decision, challenge it, or find a way to circumvent it entirely? And what about William? Could he maintain authority and composure in the face of potential defiance from the very brother he had chosen to exclude? These questions, unanswered and tantalizing, created a narrative that gripped everyone, from palace insiders to global audiences glued to every headline. And as we move into the next chapter, the real drama begins to unfold. The decisions made in private, the whispered conversations, the strategic maneuvers, all set the stage for a confrontation that would captivate the world. A rift that had been quietly growing was now about to be exposed, with consequences that would extend far beyond a single awards ceremony. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. At first glance, the BAFTAs might seem like just another glamorous awards show, a red carpet parade filled with sequins, tailored suits, and flashing cameras. But in the context of Harry and William, the 2026 ceremony was much more than that. It was a symbol, a stage, and in many ways, a battlefield. To understand why, we have to peel back the layers of prestige, protocol, and power that define the British royal family's public life. Because what seems like a simple invitation, or in this case, a ban, was anything but simple. For Prince William, the BAFTAs represented more than an awards night. They were a chance to showcase the monarchy in a controlled, curated environment. Every appearance, every handshake, every subtle gesture was scrutinized not only by the media, but by millions around the world. This was about projecting stability, control, and the image of a family in harmony, even when the truth was far more complicated. In William's mind, the optics mattered. They always mattered. One misstep, one public moment of perceived weakness, could reverberate across headlines, social media, and international news outlets in ways that the family could neither fully predict nor easily control. Harry, on the other hand, viewed these events through a different lens. While he understood the importance of public perception, he was less concerned with maintaining an image of perfection and more focused on authenticity, connection, and personal expression. For him, attending the BAFTAs could have been a statement, an assertion of independence, a chance to remind the world that he existed on his own terms, even within a system designed to keep him in a specific role. But this is where the tension deepens. What one brother sees as harmless or even necessary, the other interprets as a threat. And in this fictionalized yet emotionally plausible scenario, that difference of perspective set the stage for a dramatic confrontation. The 2026 BAFTAs were not just any year's ceremony. Rumors circulating within palace circles suggested that this particular event was intended to be larger, more high-profile, and more globally significant than ever before. The organizers, keenly aware of the royal presence, had planned intricate seating arrangements, meticulously choreographed entrances, and even subtle nods to history and tradition. For William, this was an opportunity to cement his image as a modern yet dutiful royal, someone capable of bridging the gap between tradition and contemporary culture. Every detail mattered, and the thought of Harry potentially attending threatened to disrupt the delicate balance he was trying to maintain. And it wasn't just about optics or tradition. The BAFTAs had become a proxy battlefield for larger cultural and familial tensions. By 2026, Harry had established himself as a prominent figure in media, philanthropy, and public discourse, often challenging expectations and norms. William, meanwhile, had cultivated a careful reputation built on consistency, duty, and measured public appearances. The clash of these approaches, spontaneity versus protocol, individuality versus tradition, was inevitable. The BAFTAs, with their global audience and intense media scrutiny, were the perfect setting for this clash to play out in the most public of ways. Insiders described months of preparation leading up to the event. Advisors debated potential scenarios. What if Harry showed up uninvited? How would the cameras frame the brothers' interactions? What could be done to maintain a semblance of control without escalating tensions further? Every decision carried risk. Every choice could ignite headlines, social media storms, and international speculation. And amidst all this, the emotional stakes were as high as the logistical ones. For both brothers, the BAFTAs were a test, not just of image, but of family loyalty, personal boundaries, and the ability to navigate an increasingly fragile relationship under intense public scrutiny. The significance of the BAFTAs also extended beyond the brothers themselves. Within the palace, aides, advisors, and senior staff understood that this was a moment with far-reaching consequences. If Harry were allowed to attend, it could be interpreted as a reconciliation or a sign of leniency. If he were excluded, it could be seen as an overt assertion of authority, a public declaration that certain boundaries could not be crossed. Neither outcome was without risk. And in a world where every move was dissected, every glance analyzed, and every whispered comment broadcast across continents, the pressure was immense. The media, too, played a role in amplifying the stakes. Months before the event, speculation began to circulate about who would attend, who might be seated together, and what the brothers' interactions might reveal. Journalists pored over every historical detail, every public appearance, and every past disagreement, connecting dots that insiders might have preferred remained private. By the time the BAFTAs approached, the narrative was already spinning out of control, with public interest reaching a fever pitch. The world was watching, anticipating, and waiting for a moment of drama that, in many ways, had been carefully manufactured, or at least, carefully permitted by circumstance. But it wasn't just about perception. There were real emotional consequences for both brothers. For Harry, the possibility of being excluded from an event he valued deeply was a personal affront, a reminder of the distance that had grown between him and William. For William, enforcing such a ban was emotionally complex, a balancing act between protecting the family's image and managing his own relationship with his younger brother. Every decision carried weight, every action was charged, and every conversation, whether private or public, contributed to an atmosphere thick with anticipation, anxiety, and unspoken tension. The BAFTAs also represented a cultural crossroads. In 2026, the awards ceremony had become more than a celebration of film. It was a global stage for social issues, for advocacy, and for statements about identity, responsibility, and influence. Harry's presence, whether intended as a subtle message or a more overt statement, would inevitably carry political and cultural undertones. And in a world where the royal family is often expected to remain apolitical, the tension between personal expression and institutional expectation became even more pronounced. For William, this heightened the stakes. Controlling Harry's participation, or lack thereof, was not simply about family pride. It was about managing symbolism, influence, and perception on a global scale. As the days ticked down to the event, the atmosphere was electric. Advisors monitored every development, strategists planned for multiple contingencies, and the brothers themselves were navigating a complex emotional landscape. Harry grappled with feelings of exclusion, anger, and frustration, while William weighed authority, responsibility, and the potential fallout from a high-profile confrontation. Meanwhile, the world speculated, discussed, and debated, every conversation adding fuel to a fire that threatened to burn out of control. And then came the whispers. Small, almost imperceptible, yet impossible to ignore. Whispers that the ban might be more than a simple scheduling decision, that it could represent a deeper, more personal rift. Whispers that suggested hidden conversations, secret deliberations, and a level of planning that few outside the palace could have imagined. The tension, already palpable, began to thrum like a drumbeat, heralding a storm that was about to break. By the time the BAFTAs arrived, it was clear that this was more than just an award ceremony. It was a test, a confrontation, and a dramatic tableau upon which the future of a complicated sibling relationship and the perception of a global family would be projected. Every glance, every smile, every movement would be interpreted, analyzed, and dissected. The stakes were higher than ever, and the potential for dramatic revelation loomed large. But what made the 2026 BAFTAs truly consequential was not the event itself. It was what it revealed about the brothers, their relationship, and the pressures that shaped their lives. It was a mirror reflecting not only personal grievances and familial tension, but also broader questions about loyalty, authority, and identity in a world where every action is magnified and every misstep can become global news. And so, as the stage was set, the cameras primed, and the audience eagerly anticipating, the tension between Harry and William reached its zenith. The ban, the whispers, and the anticipation created a scenario where every possibility seemed plausible, and every outcome uncertain. But what came next would shock the world, and no one could predict how deep this rift would cut, or what consequences it would unleash. The story of the BAFTA ban didn't start on a red carpet. It didn't start with flashing cameras or a viral headline. It began in the hushed, ornate corridors of Kensington Palace, far from public view, where whispers travel faster than official announcements, and every word carries weight. This is where decisions are made, where influence collides with emotion, and where even the most routine choices can ignite crises. Inside those walls, a storm was gathering, fueled by tension, protocol, and a brotherly rivalry that had been quietly simmering for years. Sources inside the palace describe a scene charged with anticipation. Advisors moved briskly from room to room, speaking in low tones, reviewing schedules, and preparing for contingencies. Every action, from the arrangement of furniture to the timing of phone calls, was calculated to ensure precision. It was a world of subtle power plays. Who enters first, who sits where, who speaks and when. And in this carefully choreographed environment, one question loomed larger than any other. What would happen with Prince Harry and the 2026 BAFTAs? At the heart of it was William. His approach was methodical, almost surgical. Advisors recall him pacing in private chambers, reviewing potential scenarios, weighing the optics against the emotional consequences, and considering the long-term implications for both his family and the monarchy. He was not a man who acted impulsively, especially in matters with global visibility. Every choice was measured, deliberate, and designed to maintain authority while managing the perception of unity. But even someone as calculated as William cannot fully control human emotion, and that is where the tension escalated. Behind closed doors, there were debates, heated and quiet, that few outside the palace would ever hear. One camp argued that Harry's attendance could be tolerated, perhaps even seen as a conciliatory gesture. Another warned that any deviation from protocol might be interpreted as weakness or indecision. The discussions were not just about public appearances. They were about symbolism, hierarchy, and legacy. Every advisor understood that the BAFTAs were no ordinary event. They were a global stage upon which the royal family's image could be both solidified and shattered. The weight of the decision rested heavily on William, who, according to insiders, faced a complex interplay of duty, pride, and emotion. He was protecting the institution, yes, but also navigating a personal relationship fraught with history, expectations, and unspoken grievances. Every word he uttered, every gesture he made, had the potential to ignite speculation. And yet, the pressure did not make him waver. If anything, it hardened his resolve. The choice to bar Harry from attending the BAFTAs was not impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and designed to assert control in a situation that had become increasingly unpredictable. Harry's absence, however, was more than just a logistical issue. Advisors within Kensington recognized its potential to generate media frenzy. The palace communications team, usually focused on subtle messaging, was suddenly thrust into crisis mode. How do you explain a brother's absence without exposing internal conflict? How do you maintain dignity while managing curiosity, rumors, and leaks that could spread worldwide within minutes? The stakes were high, and the room was alive with tension, each decision layered with complexity. As the planning unfolded, security, scheduling, and public relations teams worked in tandem. Messages were drafted, schedules double-checked, and potential outcomes simulated. Every advisor knew that a single misstep could result in a headline the family could never fully control. But even the most meticulous planning cannot account for the emotional reactions of those involved. William, as careful as he was, could not predict Harry's response with certainty. And that uncertainty was both a risk and an opportunity, depending on how you looked at it. The dynamics inside Kensington were not only professional, they were intensely personal. Sources suggest that private conversations between William and his closest confidants were laced with emotion, concern, and an awareness of history. Memories of shared childhoods, family milestones, and private jokes collided with current realities. William reportedly wrestled with conflicting impulses. The desire to protect the monarchy and its image, the instinct to enforce boundaries, and the emotional pull of a brother he still cared about deeply. The resulting tension, insiders say, was palpable, almost electric. Meanwhile, Harry's presence, or absence, was the subject of constant scrutiny, even before the formal announcement of the ban. Palace staff reported subtle hints that Harry sensed something was amiss. A delayed response to an invitation, a change in tone during conversations, the careful phrasing of communications that left room for ambiguity. Harry, ever perceptive, noticed the undercurrents. The question for him became, what exactly was happening behind those ornate doors, and why was he being sidelined? There were also whispers about intermediary conversations. Messages were reportedly passed through trusted aides, testing boundaries and probing reactions. Some were sent directly to Harry, others indirectly through third parties. Each interaction carried layers of meaning. Were they negotiations, warnings, or subtle threats? And in a palace environment where the line between personal emotion and professional obligation is constantly blurred, deciphering intent became a challenge. Every nuance mattered, every pause spoke volumes, and every decision contributed to the growing storm of tension. Then came the pivotal moment, described by insiders as both ordinary and extraordinary. William, in consultation with senior advisors, reached a definitive conclusion. Harry would not attend the 2026 BAFTAs. The decision, while carefully framed as adherence to protocol and tradition, carried unmistakable personal weight. It was not just about scheduling, seating, or optics. It was about asserting authority, maintaining boundaries, and sending a clear message, both to Harry and to the world. Reactions within the palace were mixed. Some advisors applauded the clarity of the decision, recognizing its necessity in terms of hierarchy and public perception. Others feared the backlash, the emotional fallout, the media speculation, the potential for global debate. Whispers circulated about the possible consequences, public scrutiny, personal conflict, and the risk of deepening a rift that had already been simmering for years. Every choice had consequences, and every consequence had layers that extended far beyond Kensington Palace. The human element was impossible to ignore. William, despite his composure, reportedly felt the weight of his decision acutely. Even as he enforced protocol, he knew it would affect Harry personally, emotionally, and publicly. The decision was a calculated one, yes, but it was not devoid of empathy or awareness. William understood the stakes not only in terms of image, but in terms of family bonds. And yet, the pressure to act decisively, to control perception, and to maintain order outweighed hesitation. As the BAFTAs approached, the tension inside Kensington Palace became a silent drumbeat, echoing through corridors, offices, and private chambers. Advisors prepared for potential scenarios. How would Harry react publicly? How would the media interpret the absence? Could this decision spark reconciliation, confrontation, or even a broader conflict? Every potential outcome was analyzed, every contingency planned, yet uncertainty lingered. Because in family dynamics, especially ones complicated by duty, history, and global visibility, even the most meticulous planning cannot anticipate human emotion. This was a turning point. The decision had been made, the message had been delivered, and yet the implications were only beginning to unfold. Every insider understood that what had started as an internal deliberation now had the potential to become a global narrative. Every whisper, every glance, and every subtle hint would be magnified under the public eye. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test loyalty, emotion, and the fragile bonds of brotherhood. And so, inside Kensington, as the final arrangements were confirmed and the palace braced for public attention, one thing was certain. The decision to bar Harry from the BAFTAs was not the end of the story, it was only the beginning. What would happen when Harry received the news? How would he respond to what was, in essence, a deeply personal, yet globally visible rebuke? And what consequences would ripple outward from a decision made in the quiet halls of the palace, far from the public gaze? But what came next would push both brothers into uncharted territory. And no one could predict just how far this rift would go, or what explosive events it would set into motion. It was a call that lasted just 3 minutes. 3 minutes that, in hindsight, would echo far beyond the walls of any palace room or boardroom. To an outsider, it might have seemed mundane, a routine check-in, a polite conversation between two people in positions of influence. But in reality, this single phone call became the pivot point upon which the entire 2026 BAFTA controversy would swing. Because sometimes, in high-stakes situations, the smallest gesture, the briefest communication, carries more weight than months of planning, debate, or deliberation. The call was initiated by William, though some insiders suggest it was prompted by a message from a palace aide who had been monitoring the unfolding scenario. The tone was formal, but tinged with tension. William, careful as ever, spoke measuredly, choosing words that conveyed authority without overt confrontation. But beneath the surface, his voice betrayed an undercurrent of concern. Concern for optics, for family dynamics, and, quietly, for Harry himself. Every syllable was chosen with intention, every pause calibrated to maximize clarity while minimizing conflict. Harry, on the other end, had a different experience entirely. Known for his directness and emotional transparency, he heard more than just words. He heard implications, undertones, and subtle cues that suggested the conversation was about far more than a simple scheduling matter. In those 3 minutes, layers of tension, history, and emotion collided. It wasn't just a call, it was a confrontation, a negotiation, and an emotional trigger all rolled into one. According to insider accounts, the call began with polite inquiries about health, schedules, and upcoming engagements, a veneer of civility masking the storm beneath. But the conversation quickly shifted. William's carefully chosen words conveyed a clear message. Harry's presence at the BAFTAs was discouraged. The reasoning was couched in terms of protocol, tradition, and public perception. Every argument was logical, strategic, and meticulously framed. And yet, for Harry, The subtext was unmistakable. This was a boundary being drawn, a line being enforced, and a decision that carried both personal and symbolic weight. The emotional impact on Harry was immediate. Those who have studied his reactions describe a complex interplay of anger, disbelief, and hurt. How could a brother, someone with whom he shared a lifetime of experiences, issue a directive that felt exclusionary and punitive? How could family loyalty and institutional authority collide in such a jarring way, leaving him caught between respect for protocol and the sting of personal rejection? Within seconds, the call had transformed from a procedural conversation into a deeply felt emotional confrontation, one that would reverberate far beyond its brief duration. William, for his part, remained composed. Insiders describe a calm, methodical approach, measured tone, careful phrasing, and deliberate pauses. He understood the stakes. Harry's reaction could not be predicted with certainty, and any escalation could have far-reaching consequences. Every word he spoke was intended to assert clarity, maintain authority, and reinforce boundaries without provoking open conflict. And yet, even the most disciplined approach cannot control emotion entirely. For William, there was always the risk that his brother would interpret firmness as hostility, protocol as punishment, and authority as personal affront. The content of the call has never been publicly disclosed in full, but fragments of it, reported anonymously by palace aides and insiders, hint at the delicate balance of negotiation and emotional tension. Phrases like, "Consider the implications," "Protocol must be maintained," and "This is not personal," were reportedly exchanged. To William, these were assurances. To Harry, they were both challenge and affront. The friction, invisible to the casual observer, was palpable to both parties, setting the stage for a cascade of responses that would shape the unfolding drama. What made this call particularly explosive was the underlying context. Harry had been preparing, in his own way, to engage publicly with cultural events like the BAFTAs. Invitations, travel arrangements, and schedule confirmations were already in motion. To be told, even indirectly, that he was now unwelcome was more than a logistical inconvenience. It was a profound personal and symbolic moment. It crystallized the tension between autonomy and authority, freedom and restriction, personal ambition and institutional expectation. In 3 minutes, years of subtle disagreements, emotional baggage, and unspoken resentments coalesced into a single, undeniable confrontation. Observers outside the palace, of course, had no idea of the intensity occurring behind closed doors. To the world, the conversation was invisible, yet its consequences would soon become impossible to ignore. For Harry, the call ignited a process of reflection and decision-making. How should he respond? Should he push back, accept the situation quietly, or take an alternative approach to assert his presence in a symbolic way? And for William, the call confirmed the necessity of clear boundaries, yet also illuminated the emotional cost of enforcing them. Every decision from that point forward would carry the weight of those 3 minutes, and every outcome would be interpreted through the lens of that moment. Immediately after the call, insiders suggest that both brothers experienced a surge of emotional intensity. Harry reportedly paced, replaying the words, tone, and subtext in his mind. The sense of exclusion, the perceived slight, and the reminder of long-standing differences collided in a way that left him both frustrated and resolute. Meanwhile, William returned to advisors, discussing contingencies, rehearsing statements, and preparing for potential reactions. The palace, always conscious of optics, moved swiftly to manage any ripple effects before the conversation could leak or inspire speculation. This call also triggered an internal chain reaction within the palace. Advisors debated how to frame the situation if the news reached the press. Security protocols were reviewed, potential media responses rehearsed, and public relations strategies refined. Every eventuality was anticipated, yet uncertainty lingered. Human emotion, particularly between two brothers with a complicated history, could never be fully contained. Every moment from this point forward was poised on a knife's edge, an unpredictable blend of calculated strategy and raw emotional reaction. And then came the whispers. Staff members, overhearing fragments of conversation, speculated about tone, timing, and intent. Informal channels within the palace began to circulate interpretations, some emphasizing adherence to tradition, others hinting at personal conflict. By the time Harry emerged from his private reflection, the palace was already alive with speculation, rumor, and anticipation. The call had set a chain in motion. A chain whose effects would reach not only the BAFTA stage but the global media landscape. By the end of the day, it was clear the call had changed everything. It clarified intentions, revealed boundaries, and ignited emotional responses that could not be ignored. Harry now had to decide how to respond, whether to challenge, accept, or find another path. William, meanwhile, understood that his decision had already set forces in motion, forces he could guide but not fully control. The stage was set for conflict, confrontation, and drama that extended far beyond the palace walls. And so, the 3-minute phone call became far more than a simple conversation. It was the catalyst for action, a spark that illuminated deep, familial tensions, and a trigger for a series of events that would culminate in a confrontation watched by the world. What seemed like a routine exchange was in fact the moment when private disagreements became public anticipation, when subtle tension transformed into explosive potential, and when the BAFTA ban evolved from possibility to inevitability. But what came next, how Harry chose to react, and what maneuvers William had already anticipated, would shift the balance in ways no one could predict and set the stage for a dramatic escalation that would captivate audiences worldwide. The word ban carries weight, but within the walls of Kensington Palace, it carried even more, a quiet, invisible authority capable of shaping public perception, personal relationships, and global headlines. To anyone outside, it might have seemed like a simple instruction. Harry would not attend the 2026 BAFTAs. But behind closed doors, the ban was far more than that. It was a strategic declaration, a carefully orchestrated move with emotional undertones, political significance, and personal implications. It was a moment that crystallized years of tension, friction, and unspoken resentment into a single, decisive action. The decision to bar Harry did not happen spontaneously. William, after careful deliberation and consultation with advisors, had reached the conclusion that the risk of Harry attending outweighed any potential benefits. He considered protocol, optics, public perception, and, crucially, the symbolic message that allowing Harry to participate would send. It wasn't about preventing Harry from having fun at an award ceremony. It was about asserting control, maintaining hierarchy, and signaling that boundaries, even familial ones, could not be crossed lightly. Within the palace, the atmosphere was tense. Advisors moved quietly, ensuring that every step of the decision-making process was documented, coordinated, and managed. Private rooms became theaters of negotiation, where words were weighed as carefully as actions. Staff who were privy to the discussions described a near-sacred intensity, a sense that each moment carried immense consequence. The ban, while framed as adherence to protocol, had the power to ignite a media frenzy, alter family dynamics, and shape public perception for months, if not years. William, as always, approached the matter methodically. He spoke to advisors in hushed tones, reviewing potential scenarios. What if Harry publicly defied the ban? What if media speculation escalated? What would the palace say? And how could they manage global attention without further inflaming tensions? Every question was addressed with meticulous planning, rehearsed responses, and contingency measures. Yet, even the most carefully constructed plans could not control human emotion, particularly Harry's. For Harry, learning of the ban was a deeply personal blow. It was not merely exclusion from an event. It was a public declaration of boundaries that felt both arbitrary and punitive. Those close to him described a surge of anger, frustration, and hurt. Emotions amplified by the intimate yet globally visible nature of the family dynamic. Imagine preparing to attend a prestigious event, envisioning the moments you would share, the statements you might make, only to be told, perhaps indirectly, that your presence is unwelcome. The sting is not in the logistics, but in the implications, rejection, powerlessness, and the echo of past grievances. The ban also sparked strategic maneuvering behind the scenes. Advisors, understanding the delicate balance, scrambled to mitigate potential fallout. Communications teams drafted statements emphasizing protocol and tradition. Security officers reviewed potential scenarios for both public and private interactions. Public relations specialists discussed framing narratives to maintain dignity while minimizing speculation. And all the while, the emotional undercurrents, the raw tension between the brothers, remained unresolved, simmering beneath the polished surface of palace procedure. Inside Kensington, whispers spread. Staff members speculated about how Harry would respond. Would he accept the ban quietly, maintaining the appearance of respect for authority? Or would he challenge it, creating a spectacle that could not be contained? The uncertainty created a charged environment, one in which every glance, every phrase, and every decision carried amplified meaning. Observers noted the almost theatrical quality of these private discussions, a high-stakes chess game unfolding in a gilded setting, where strategy, emotion, and optics collided. The ban itself was communicated delicately. Reports suggest that a trusted intermediary delivered the message to Harry, carefully worded, emphasizing that the decision was procedural rather than personal. Yet, even the most diplomatic phrasing could not neutralize the emotional impact. Harry reportedly felt the subtle sting of exclusion, the invisible hand of authority, and the symbolic message that he was being sidelined. The situation, while framed in terms of protocol, carried layers of personal implication that made it far more potent than any simple scheduling decision. For William, the emotional calculus was complex. He understood that enforcing the ban could deepen the rift, potentially strain relationships, and invite public scrutiny. Yet, he also recognized that inaction might be interpreted as weakness or indecision, undermining his authority both within the family and on the global stage. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring careful judgment, emotional restraint, and strategic foresight. Every step carried risk, but to William, the consequences of failing to act decisively were far greater than the potential backlash. The psychological impact on both brothers was immediate. Harry, feeling excluded, was reportedly motivated by a combination of frustration and determination. The ban became not only a personal affront but a challenge to his agency, autonomy, and public persona. William, in contrast, reinforced his position with advisors, rehearsed talking points, and protocols to ensure that the palace maintained control over the narrative. It was a clash of strategy and emotion, of authority and autonomy, unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, the potential for media exposure loomed large. Even the most discreet palace staff understood that leaks were inevitable. Whispers of the ban began circulating through informal channels, sparking speculation and creating a sense of inevitability. Once the story reached journalists, it became a narrative that captivated the public imagination. Two brothers, one prestigious event, and the invisible but palpable tension between family loyalty and institutional authority. And yet, despite the meticulous planning, the ban was just the beginning. The emotional fallout, the strategic maneuvering, and the public perception challenges it created set in motion a series of events that would escalate the drama to unprecedented levels. The palace understood that while the decision was clear, the consequences were unpredictable. Every potential reaction, from Harry, from the media, from public observers, was a variable that could shift the story in unexpected directions. The ban behind closed doors also highlighted the fragile intersection of personal relationships and public responsibility. For William, it was a test of leadership, patience, and emotional discipline. For Harry, it was a challenge to his sense of fairness, recognition, and agency. Both brothers were navigating a labyrinth of expectation, history, and emotion, aware that every action would be scrutinized and every misstep amplified. The decision, while seemingly singular, resonated across multiple dimensions: personal, institutional, and global. By the end of that day, the palace had shifted into a tense state of anticipation. The ban had been enforced, but the real work, anticipating, managing, and responding to Harry's reaction, was only beginning. Inside Kensington, staff whispered about the coming confrontation, strategized about media responses, and prepared for every eventuality. The emotional charge, carefully contained until that point, was now impossible to ignore. And as the world would soon learn, the ban was not merely a procedural decision. It was a spark. It was a signal. It was a moment that would test loyalties, provoke reactions, and set the stage for a confrontation that no one could fully predict. But what came next? Harry's response, the maneuvering behind the palace walls, and the consequences that would ripple through the media and public consciousness, would escalate the drama beyond anyone's expectations, and it all began in that quiet, high-stakes room where the decision had been made. No secret in the palace stays secret for long. In an institution that balances tradition with global scrutiny, even carefully guarded decisions have a way of slipping through the cracks. The ban on Harry attending the 2026 BAFTAs was supposed to remain behind closed doors, a private family matter framed as adherence to protocol. But as insiders often warn, the palace is a living, breathing organism, full of staff, aides, and advisors who move between duty and curiosity, discretion and gossip. And in this case, a leak, intentional or accidental, would ignite a firestorm that no one could have predicted. The first whispers began in hushed tones, passing from aide to aide, from security officer to communications staff. Some described it as a casual mention. "I heard he won't be attending." Others suggested a more deliberate act, an intentional release to test reactions or gauge public sentiment. By the time it reached palace journalists and informal contacts in the media, the language had transformed from simple information into tantalizing suggestion. "There's tension. Harry's being kept away." William made the call, and once the seed was planted, it spread like wildfire. The leak immediately complicated everything. Suddenly, the carefully controlled narrative, which had emphasized protocol, discretion, and family unity, became a story of conflict, exclusion, and brotherly betrayal. Headlines speculated on the reasons. Was it personal animosity? A clash of values? A power struggle? Social media erupted with debate, analysis, and conjecture, turning what had been a private decision into global spectacle. Advisors scrambled, trying to contain damage, draft statements, and anticipate Harry's response, but the genie was already out of the bottle. For Harry, learning that the ban had leaked was electrifying. The sense of exclusion intensified, but so did a newfound opportunity. The leak made it clear that the world was watching, that the story was no longer just about a ceremony, but about his relationship with William, about family loyalty, and about control. Emotionally, it was a complex mix of frustration, anger, and resolve. The leak had made private tension public, and Harry now had to consider not only his personal feelings, but also the global perception of the situation. William, on the other hand, faced the consequences of the leak with a mixture of frustration and calculation. Sources suggest that he immediately convened advisors to determine how best to manage the narrative. Containing speculation, controlling the message, and maintaining authority became paramount. Every detail, from official statements to social media monitoring, was analyzed. Yet, even with meticulous planning, the leak exposed a vulnerability. Information, once in the world, takes on a life of its own. It is no longer controllable, only navigable. The leak also exposed the delicate dynamics of palace staff. Some were sympathetic to Harry, interpreting the exclusion as unfair. Others prioritized loyalty to William and the institution. Conversations that might have remained private were now amplified, influencing perception and behavior. The atmosphere inside Kensington became electric, filled with tension, speculation, and the awareness that a minor slip of information could have outsized consequences. Every aide understood the stakes. One misstatement, one misinterpreted comment, and the narrative could spiral further beyond the palace's control. Media speculation intensified quickly. Pundits, commentators, and royal enthusiasts dissected every past interaction between Harry and William. Analysts dug into previous public appearances, interviews, and social media posts, looking for evidence of tension or rivalry. Every glance, every word, every historical anecdote was reframed as proof of the feud. The BAFTAs, once a celebration of cinema, became a symbolic battlefield representing authority, rebellion, and familial discord. The leak had transformed a private decision into a public spectacle overnight. The emotional stakes for Harry escalated further. Reports suggest that he felt both vindicated and provoked. The world now recognized the exclusion, and yet it also magnified the personal slight. The leak created a paradox. It both empowered and agitated him. He now had to decide how to respond in a world watching his every move. Would he confront the issue publicly, challenge the decision privately, or find a third way that asserted his presence without overt defiance? The choice carried consequences not only for himself, but for the perception of the entire family. William, acutely aware of the leak's impact, began recalibrating his approach. Every potential scenario, from media fallout to Harry's possible reactions, was analyzed. Strategies for damage control were put into motion, including drafting statements, coordinating with communications teams, and ensuring that security protocols could handle any public encounters. Yet, despite all the planning, there remained one unknown variable: Harry's response. And in the palace, as insiders often note, the unpredictable element of human emotion is the one factor that cannot be fully controlled. The leak also exposed an important truth about power within the palace. Authority is fragile when transparency meets emotion. While the ban was initially intended as a controlled, internal measure, the leak revealed the limits of such control. Information, once released, shapes reality. The palace could no longer dictate how the story would be told or perceived. It could only react, adapt, and attempt to guide the narrative. And in that moment, the delicate balance between institutional authority and personal relationships became painfully clear. For the world watching, the leak was irresistible. Headlines screamed of conflict and exclusion, analysts speculated endlessly, and social media users dissected every subtle historical detail for meaning. The narrative evolved rapidly, each new rumor or report adding layers to an already complex story. The BAFTAs and the ban itself were no longer merely an event. They had become a symbol, a proxy for larger questions of loyalty, autonomy, and family power dynamics. But perhaps most consequentially, the leak forced both brothers into action. Harry had to decide how to respond, balancing emotion, strategy, and public perception. William had to anticipate those responses, maintaining authority while mitigating potential fallout. The private, calculated tension of Kensington had now entered the global stage, and every move from this point forward would be observed, analyzed, and magnified.